Bose's Indian National Army, now 40,000 strong, was as ready as it ever would be. They would join the Japanese in the assault across the Burmese border to Imphal in India. On April the 14th, 1944, Bose led his male troops on the offensive, planting the Azad Hind freedom flag on Indian soil for the first time. After months of training, the women began their mobilization. The first 100 women, fit and trained to fight, boarded trains for the perilous journey from Singapore. They would travel along the Death Railway through Malaya and Thailand to Burma.
You travel by night. Day you had to be in a certain area and the trains would be camouflaged because of the bombing, etc. So you went by night.
Once in Burma, they continued with training, eager to prove themselves on the front.
In Burma, we had a wonderful period of training where we'd assault an INA area. They would be defending and we would be assaulting. And you know, going through swamps, going through paddy fields, and leeches as long as about 6 or 8 inches stuck onto your jodhpurs.
They were soon joined by new Burmese recruits. Even as the battle for India progressed, support poured in from the surrounding villages. Manawati Iyer was born in Burma. She wore the uniform of a Rani of Jhansi, but spent her days trekking village to village to enlist more women.
She used to go alone in the jungles of Burma, where there were air raids on top. But I don't know, we thought it was very dangerous and very brave of her. Recruiting, doing propaganda. And we were very short of medicines, so she used to go and try and get medicines also. I was actually not with the fighting force. I did not learn any military science, in fact, except sometimes when I used to take day off, I used to see them and join them also to have some knowledge about it. Otherwise, I did not know even how to salute. Within 3-4 days, I had the uniform. Now, after wearing the uniform, for the first time I went to Netaji's office, and I did not know whether I should put on the cap when to salute him or to keep the cap away from my head.
But the British were fighting aggressively to regain Burma, with well-supplied troops and arms. Their bombing raids were a constant threat, and the women's barracks were not spared from bombardment.
As soon as we were all outside, and I started counting to see if everybody was there. And it's always easier to remember numbers than names. Then there was one less, so I said somebody's missing. Then we wondered who it was, and then one of the girls said, oh, so-and-so is not come. So we knew where she was, and we dashed there and found her fast asleep. So we just pulled her out and saved her.
Part of Bose's plan was to liberate India by persuading Indians fighting for the British to switch sides. However, the British had been careful to block any news of the INA. As far as their Indian troops knew, the INA was just a traitorous bunch of renegades, puppets of the Japanese. They knew nothing of the INA's nationalist agenda.
They put on a struggle to really defend those frontiers as the frontiers of the British Raj. And they won at that point of time.
Since the Indian troops fighting for the British would not surrender, the INA would have to crush them in battle. But they were dwarves among giants, fighting tanks and aircraft with rifles and bullock carts. There was little support from their Japanese allies. This was 1944, 2 years after the battles of Midway and the Coral Sea. The Japanese were now on the defensive. Their air force was overextended in the Pacific, and Japan couldn't provide support or even the basic supplies the INA needed.
The war had turned. The war had turned on a broader scale, and the British had begun to fight back very well on that front with the Japanese. But the key thing was the Japanese supply lines could not sustain the war effort.
With their supply lines stretched to the limit, the INA fought courageously, but in food, transport, medicine and weapons, they were woefully under-equipped. Then, in a knockout blow, the monsoon rains arrived early. Some 70% of the troops were stricken with malaria or dysentery, and many of them died in the jungle. The women's regiment was frustrated. It was already too late to join the battle in India. The losses were too heavy, and Bose wouldn't permit them to go with the men to the front. They had to content themselves with being passive observers.
We were absolutely devastated. How could we, who came with so much of enthusiasm and so much of determination to be warriors for freedom, were now vanquished?
A group presented Netaji with a petition, signed in blood, begging to be part of a suicide unit, the Jhansi Bose. They would be trained in espionage and expected to infiltrate India as spies. They must never allow themselves to be captured alive. Rasama was upset to find her name rejected.
So I said, Netaji, you ask for sacrifice. You ask for blood. You ask for our courage to enter into any sector of the war in order to win freedom for India. Why have you deprived me of this honor and this privilege? And he said, what would I say to your mother if you never come home?
But for some girls of the Rani of Jhansi Regiment, the next journey would be their last. The war against the British was not going to plan. Ill-equipped and assaulted by the monsoon rains, the Indian National Army was in tatters. In Rangoon, the Rani of Jhansi Regiment continued to train amidst constant bombing raids and looming defeat, still hoping for the chance to support their male comrades.
The thing was interesting was that I was very afraid that they would panic and they would be screaming and crying and fear. But they had none of this. They stood up to it so well and with such discipline that I was really impressed by it and felt that we had done the right thing.
Bose was unwilling to concede defeat. He urged his troops to continue fighting against the British, even as they pushed relentlessly into Burma. In a letter to his supporters dated 14th of August 1945, Bose urged them to stay calm in the face of rumors that hostilities had ceased. But the British were pressing a victorious path through Burma, and Bose finally accepted that he must retreat or face capture. He ordered the Rani of Jhansi Regiment back to Singapore.
Oh, everything was in tatters as it was, our feelings were in tatters.
Lakshmi was using her medical skills, caring for civilians and injured soldiers. During the confusion of retreat, she was caught, deep in the Karen Hills, where she'd been building makeshift hospital wards to care for the wounded.
We were cut off from the main army and we were just the women's regiment. Then suddenly, one early morning, some Japanese entered our camp.
This Japanese unit, fresh from the war in China, knew nothing of the INA. They suspected Lakshmi was a pro-British guerrilla.
And they were tying us up on trees. Then I told them that I want to go and put on my uniform. So I went in and put on my uniform and came out. And then they tied me on a tree. Then, a little while later, one Japanese came with a paper in his hand, and he looked at the paper, and then he looked at us. Then he looked at the paper. Then he came near me and brought the paper to it. That was a photo of myself with Netaji.
Only a photo seen in a magazine saved her life.